Toby Hammerschlag grew up in South Africa, immigrating to Australia with her husband and two daughters in 1986. She was a special education teacher for many years, specialising in literacy. While teaching, she would write passages and stories for her students when she couldn't find an appropriate text for them. After retiring from teaching, she did an oral history course with the Chief Oral History Librarian at the State Library of New South Wales. She then interviewed people in order to preserve their family stories. Some of the characters in her recent novel have been inspired by these interviews. Her first book, The Rooftop, was published in 2015. It is a story of friendship between four young students from diverse cultural and social backgrounds. The book celebrates freedom and diversity and has been widely used in schools. Looking Out and Beyond is her second novel. The research and writing of her novel has taken 5 years. Toby and her husband live on the upper north shore of Sydney and is now a grandmother of five. Wow. Welcome to the Hybrid Author podcast, Toby.
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to speaking to you.
We are absolutely honoured and thrilled for you to join us. Thank you so much. So, can you tell us how you came to be a writer? Was this when you were writing text for your students, or was it when you were a child, or how did you pick up pen to paper?
I think that I've always loved writing, and even going back to school days, which is quite a long time ago, I was always the creative one, and I always loved writing. As you said before, when you were talking about my bio, I was a special ed teacher for many years, specializing in literacy. And it left little writing time or emotional time or any time to pursue writing. However, when I had students with literacy difficulties and I just couldn't find an appropriate text, I would write stories for them. And I'm only sorry that I didn't keep any of them.
No.
But then when I retired, I did an oral history course, which kind of fits into being a writer because I'm interested in people, I'm interested in stories. And then I went on to writing.
Amazing. No, that's great. That could be another book in you, I guess, the text for people that needed help with it, your students.
Yes. And in fact, there's a character in my first book, The Rooftop, and she's a little girl, has a learning difficulty, bright, creative. And that's one of the kind of the kids I taught and others.
It seems like you draw inspiration from those around you, but also from your own personal experiences.
I do.
Yeah, today we are here to talk about your new novel, Looking Out and
Yeah.
Beyond. And this story is quite personal. It's deeply rooted in your own childhood experiences of growing up in apartheid South Africa. So, what inspired you to fictionalize this particular part of your life, and how did you approach your memories and historical facts?
Yes, this story was percolating in my head for a long time. And of course, it is my story in the sense that I grew up in apartheid South Africa, immigrating to Australia in 1986 when the state of emergency was declared in South Africa. We wanted to immigrate for a long time, but when the state of emergency was declared and civil liberties weren't guaranteed and people could be incarcerated without recourse to getting a trial, that's when we decided, literally at that time, we are now leaving this country. But so the motivation for this book comes from a family that I knew and I know very well. It lived in South Africa, in the rural part of South Africa.
Mm.
And they established on their farm a school for the Black kids. Huge undertaking, endeavor, and very brave.
Mm.
Because, I mean, one of the reasons that they established the school was that the education for people of color was inferior. They wanted to give the opportunity to these kids, and that's what I have in my novel too. So they were the inspiration. That's what I have in my novel. These are people in the novel. They are white South Africans living in rural South Africa, and they want to improve the life for the people around them. In rural South Africa, there was the people that surrounded them. They, they were great supporters of the nationalist government, the government that was in power. So if you established a school or acted in the most decent way towards people of color, you were ostracized by the people around you. And that comes out in my book. These people. So in my book, you have these people who are forming the school on their farm against this background of astonishment for the people around them. The characters in the main protagonist is someone called Ada in the book. She's a girl of 12 years old, and she lives a privileged life in South Africa. On this farm, she loves this farm. She doesn't look beyond the confines of her world until she comes into contact with a girl of mixed descent who brings with her another complete world, which opens up the world for Ada. I've brought my story into that because even though it's completely fiction, it's not, because it's historical. It paints the divide between white people in South Africa and a young person growing up and a person of color who's every day there would be harassment. Every day was a struggle. Yes, it's autobiographical, but it's been fictionalized, but it is against that historical
Mm.
background.
Yeah, no, that's so powerful. I couldn't even, I've obviously seen movies and read some books on that era, but to actually have witnessed it, I couldn't even imagine. Was there a specific reason you went for, 12-year-old girl over, say, a different age group or anything like that? Was that strategic in any way, or just how they perceive the world, or?
Yes, my last book was for the audience was end of primary. I wanted to write for high school students. She became a 12-year-old girl. I've incorporated as a subplot the Second World War. And so there was a practical reason because I had to work out an age. I wanted her to be born at the time of the war when her father was sent to North Africa and her mother is a war bride. And
Mm.
so she's born there. And the first time she is meets her father is during that time. And I also think that when he returns from war, but I also think that a 12, 13-year-old girl, the world's just opening up to them. And I think that's an amazing age. So to discover the world at that age is quite important.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of you're still in adolescence, but you're dropping that sort of really child, aren't you? And kind of
Yes, yeah.
heading through into puberty.
What we have in the book is that Ada wants to be independent. She's an only child. But on the other hand, what you're saying is this dual feeling of being still wanting to be protected, but
Mm.
still wanting to be out there.
Yeah.
And it's that emerging from your innocent childhood.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great. Well, you mentioned World War II. You do have some complex themes in there, racial injustice, apartheid, as we said, and migration. How have you used your background as a literacy educator to sort of soften those subjects? And how have you actually thought about like school curriculum with this book? Your first book's been well received in schools, and
Yes.
how have you sort of weaved in these big complex themes into books, for children? How have you
Yes.
managed that?
So the theme of the Second World War, it really only emerged after I began writing. That I didn't intend to. It's a subplot, but it fits into the narrative of the book, and all is revealed at the end because and I don't want to give too much away
No.
about them, but what happens to Joan in the war and his interaction with indigenous soldiers is what determines how he lives his life with his wife Jahelia afterwards.
Mm,
But going back to the curriculum, I wrote the book without even thinking about the curriculum.
that's good.
But there's obviously a teacher in me that always comes out. And only after I'd finished the book, I actually looked up the history curriculum, and I thought, wow, there's apartheid, there's Second World War, and the poor treatment of indigenous soldiers.
Right, yeah.
It fits in. But I think that, as you say, they're complex themes. And how does one bring them? I think the nature of the book lends itself to a young reader being able to absorb it.
Mm,
And I'm hoping that I've brought my experience of teaching literature to young people. So the book is a highly structured book in a way. So we start off there's a historical introduction. And so a student that's reading it in Australia can begin to get an idea and be transported into a world that they have never understood.
Yeah. Mm.
And then you have the narrative.
Yep.
And I think also what I've done in the narrative, and also this evolved in the writing, the narrative is written in the third person. And the war stories are written in the first person. It's mainly through the eyes of Ada, but she wants to discover the secrets of why her father behaves the way he is, why he doesn't tell us what's happened. And I think that will add interest
Mm.
for the reader, and they'd be able to understand and relate to complex topics. Certainly, they make the structure of the book. Sorry, I got sidetracked. There's a glossary at the end of the book. One is, and so it will help the reader navigate the book. And I know people who actually they look up the glossary as they go along.
Right, amazing.
One of the other ways in which I think it makes it accessible to the reader is that within the book, there's a lot of description. And I think people can be transported to a rural town. It's quite interesting that people who've read the book said, well, I've been transported, I'm Australian, but it's like a rural town in Australia. Then someone else, when I mentioned that, when I was being interviewed in Canberra at the bookshop, and I mentioned that and I said, apartheid aside, it's a rural town. The owner said to me, but hang on a minute, in the 1950s in Australia, Indigenous people couldn't even enter a swimming pool, a
Right,
public
yeah.
swimming pool, in the same sense as what happened in apartheid, obviously not extreme. So there's a lot of description in the book. And then when Ada is trying to discover the mystery, so there's mystery in the book, trying to discover her father's past, she goes and secretly looks at the letters written from his days in North Africa. So that you've got the letters,
Right.
which young people can read and they can see. And then Jonah reads his war diary. So it's absolutely difficult themes, but I think through the writing, I've made it accessible to my readership.
No, that's amazing. So when you set the scene, is there a lot of action in it as well, or is it quite more character driven, emotionally driven, or is it the incidences throughout, or you don't want to give
I
too much?
think it's character. There are incidents, there's climax, and there's menace
Yep.
that runs through it. We've got this policeman called Quirce, and he typifies any policeman that you would have met during that era. They were scary people.
Mm.
That menace lies there, and he comes and he visits the farm. He raids the farm when he thinks that the little girl of mixed descent, which is staying there
Mm.
on a so-called white property, and he comes in the middle of the night and he raids this property. So there is menace, but there's also happiness.
Oh,
And
good.
what I've introduced right through the book is the theme of music.
Oh, lovely.
And a lot of research went into that. So we've got ethnic music. And there's actually an Australian strand that comes into it. We've got the Australian doctor who's also seen action in North Africa, and his wife teaches on the farm, and she sometimes teaches them waltzing Matilda, and the little ethnic kids just laugh. They have never heard anything like that in their life. And so we've got all that beautiful music that's coming through in the book. And then ultimately in that last scene, when, and I won't spoil it, but Jahelia, who loves music, she's the wife of the farmer. She wants to take the black kids to see the Wizard of Oz.
Oh,
And
wow.
and they're not allowed in. And then there's a lot of drama related to that. I won't spoil us.
No, no.
And so I had the most wonderful woman in South Africa. Oh, no, sorry. I had a wonderful man doing all the music and the games that the ethnic kids played. I had him research it. And then I had the wonderful woman translating the ethnic languages.
Wow.
Both fabulous people who helped me tremendously.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I mean, it sounds like you've got a bit of everything in there, you know, the story, the action, the music, the emotional side. There's a lot going on, which, yeah, it just absolutely sounds wonderful. So your hopes for the book is to, you know, it's a big, 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 big message, empower young people to stand up against racial discrimination. What conversations or classroom discussions do you hope this book is going to spark in schools?
Right. So being a teacher, and I've got teacher notes on my website.
Mm,
So there's a more formal side where, and the book lends itself to integrative teaching,
mm,
English and history.
yep.
So there can be a more formal side. There can be the kids researching. This is a springboard, my book. It could be the formal side where kids are researching, they're researching the war, they're researching the poor treatment of Indigenous soldiers. For example, in the book, it touches on how Indigenous soldiers could not come into an RSL unless it was Anzac Day. And these were courageous
Mm,
young people. They could look into just the factual battles of the Second World War and how they fought against tyranny. And of course, apartheid South Africa and how people were treated. The other side is often in English, there's the creative side where people are studying characters and writing diary entries from the perspective of characters. And there's all that side to be explored. But in terms of conversation, what I really would like is that for young people to talk about racism and how it impacts, they could impact on their on everybody's life and how they might have come across it in their school and in their neighborhood. And to think back to the title, Looking Out and Beyond, that we need to look out and beyond our little, the confines of our world to the world of others.
Yeah, I like that.
The title was intentional in the sense that there's a physical act of looking out to see the black pickers
Mm,
coming, just arriving at the farm. And then we have the farmer and his wife looking out, but they've looked out beyond the farm. They already know what's happening
mm.
outside of their farm. But at the end of the book, when Ada is looking out, she's now has grown and looking out as a person who's learned from her experiences.
Well, it's still, you know, the themes are from the past, but they're still extremely current. So, yeah, I could imagine very powerful conversations being sparked in schools after reading your work from this as well. So you've published this with Woods Lane, and
Yes.
you know, how's that experience been?
Are you asking me about the publishing process?
Yeah, yeah. How have you found this?
Yeah, they directed me through the whole process, even though I'd been through it before. This was a little different. I was more involved in the process. And I found there was a lot that I had to do. So, for example, they gave me the name of an illustrator. And I think there was an illustrator who really wanted to do the work,
Mm,
but she was very busy and she vacillated between can she do it? Can I do it? Can't I do it? And then she put me onto someone else. I think that you saw the cover of my book, and I
mm,
think it's someone called Kettle Scoug, and he read the book and he captured the essence of the story. And there's always movement between how you perceive it and when you actually get the cover of the book. I was in Canberra at the time, and when the cover came out, I couldn't even look at it. My daughter's an art historian, and I said to her, "You look at it, tell me if it's okay." She said, "No, I think this is good." And I
okay.
went back to my hotel, and I hardly drink alcohol at all, but I went straight to the bar. But, there were issues in the publication. I mean, there were times when I had my editor was in Italy at one stage. The person who was laying out the book, he was traveling between Sydney and Melbourne. I'm not even sure he had a permanent address at the time. So negotiating all that
Mm,
was difficult.
Yeah.
But definitely Woods Lane did guided me through the process, and I am grateful for that.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Do you have any advice you want to share with other writers who maybe want to, make a social impact with their work, such as you have?
I think that if you have a story to tell or a message to put out to your readership, go for it. But it's very important to send out a message to the world. But saying that, when you're doing something that's historical fiction, like my book, you have to do a huge amount of research and to make
Mm,
sure that it's accurate.
yeah.
And so, I spent many a day in Canberra in the archives looking at diaries of soldiers. I was lucky enough, for example, to have the Honorable Justice Edwin Cameron in South Africa, who was on the Constitutional Court and wrote the new constitution for South Africa, looking at my book, very generous on his part. He looked at the historical introduction and said it was okay. And also, he looked at the language in the book, for example. And because I wanted to capture that era
Mm,
where demeaning language was used when people spoke to people of color, and I wanted to capture that. And he looked at it quite carefully and he said, there was, I was walking a fine line between authenticity and offense.
right. Yeah, that makes
And he looked at the language and he said that some of the words, even though they're accurate, you cannot use them
right,
because they are so, it's trauma triggering for people in South Africa.
right.
And then I was worried about my Australian audience. So there were a lot of hurdles that I had to overcome. So I'm saying to people who write, it's not an easy path, but it's a worthwhile path.
It's important as well. I think a lot of people might stay clear of writing these types of works because, yeah, exactly that. They're worried about what they're going to say or if they're going to cause offense, or even people voicing their opinion on how they felt, how they feel about certain things and how you're going to be perceived is a scary thing. You're very brave with what you've done, but it sounds like you've done your due diligence. You've checked your facts and had it all published so you can put it out there with confidence as well. Well, our listeners are dying to know, where can they find the book, Toby? Where is it available
Yes, I
on and
think
offline?
probably the best place would be Woods Lane Publishers, but it's also on Amazon, which is an easy option to obtain the book.
Thank you so much for sharing all you have. The book sounds fantastic. Congratulations. Yeah, really, really important story.
Thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to speak about my book. I
Thank
appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.